So welcome everybody. It's great to see so many different backgrounds and people. And as I've just said, we're going to have some little talks about seasonality. I think we're at the start of what's going to be really quite a big and unexpected programme of inquiry and work. The more we think about seasonality, the more exciting and interesting and varied it becomes. But maybe I'm jumping the gun. Maybe that's not the case. We'll see what we get to at the end of this session. So, Nico, you have 10 minutes or so on seasonality.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. And I wasn't in the previous session, so I'm going to say just a few words about myself. I'm based at Aalto University in Helsinki, or in Espoo, in Department of Design, and have been kind of using a practice theory lens to study time, temporality, rhythms in everyday life, and I guess the kind of natural rhythm somewhere behind the social rhythms is or mixing together with the social rhythms has been a long-term occupation of mine, and I kind of take this also as a study of technology, so that I see technology as something that kind of is between the natural rhythms and then how we run our daily lives. So something like artificial lighting or indoor temperatures or flat surfaces whereby we can move quickly, and all of those are kind of technological arrangements or accumulations that then make our built environment different than the natural environment, so that also the rhythms of the built environment and natural environment are different. And I'm going to start by saying that we just submitted yesterday a proposal for the Academy of Finland to study how infrastructure services create rhythms. So here I'm thinking kind of maybe the other way around, that we can also think technological systems or infrastructures as kind of like a nature, so that the train network or the electricity grid is something that you know contains some affordances or so on, and those are typically rhythmic. They are rhythmic also and social, in a sense that we have the questions of peak demand and then increasing peak load management or demand management, and I'm interested in how the kind of increasingly dynamic pricing of infrastructure services may create some kinds of shadow rhythms or some kind of excess of infrastructure service, so that you have the peak loads, you have the prime time consumption, and then you have consumption and engagement that takes place at the kind of gaps and in-betweens and in the shadows. And whether this is a kind of question of social marginalization or not, I'm not sure at all. I'm not saying that people are kind of pushed into the shadows of infrastructure access. It may be that many of us are more clever in time of kind of making use of those opportunities and so on and so forth. So it's really kind of like an empirical question, that what is the life like in the shadows of infrastructural access. So that's the proposal, and thanks for Jacopo, who is not present. Thanks for Elizabeth, who is present, and then Ted Schatzky also for supporting the proposal. And then about seasonality, I thought that I'm gonna say something that has been it's like an old presentation that I gave. Was it 2012 in Manchester? So Dale at least has probably seen it, but I'm gonna pick on. And I was looking at it, and I think that maybe it has some relevance still, and some fresh thoughts about seasonality. It's about a particular cold day in Finland, February 2nd, 1999, when there was a national collection of diary data where people were asked to report in a free format way the course of their day. What did they do? What happened? Without any further instructions. But what is interesting for this particular moment is that the day happened to be a very cold day, so that northern Finland had minus 40 degrees, southern Finland minus 5, and that's not very customary to Finland either. So a lot of kind of extra arrangements were taking place. But now if I'm going to share my screen once okay. So a few slides from this particular day when it was rather cold. And I'm kind of trying to see that how life can go on in an extraordinary kind of natural context of extreme cold. So February 2nd, 1999, temperature in the country varying from -2 to, well, the figure is -30, snow cover. I could, of course, pick any kinds of kind of natural phenomena to present that what is it like. Maybe more interesting is that what has been happening to the temperature. So this is January from that year. So it was quite a warm beginning. Then we had a cold drop. People get used to winter maybe during the first drop. Then it warms up again. You maybe change back to some practices of warmer winters, and then you go back having these drops. So I guess this is something that relates to the seasonality, that it's not like we have a winter, but within winter there are, for example, there are a lot of kind of alteration. So what happens? How do people cope with a cold? So firstly, the house or the inside environment is, of course, that's like logical, but it's very important that you have a house that is well insulated enough. If you have that, then your problems are far less severe. You may have delivery services that are better equipped to run at extreme temperatures. You may have mass media, or you have mass media that seems or wasn't interrupted on that day. There weren't breaks of any of that kind. So some of the infrastructure does look like it's kind of weather independent. Then reliability is kind of a major issue. So what you do to prepare for these kinds of things, you have extra means for starting your car. You dig your pipes deep enough. You have alternative heating systems, and so on and so forth. Mobility. Even if people would be using delivery services, there's a lot of things that they still need to kind of get from outside, and there are various ways that you do this, starting, of course, from clothing. So again, clothing is a key technology in here, but also extending to heating up car engines and so on. Something that is quite interesting, I think, is that we speak about public space, but here during this day, it's very important that public space is heated and warm and cozy. So these kinds of social gatherings on a cold day may be a bit different than in a kind of nice summer day, for example. So winter temperatures, low winter temperatures tend to kind of somehow consolidate some kind of social relations. Scheduled winter labor. So this is also something that is kind of part of the preparedness. So of course you do a lot of kind of work in order to prepare for the cold day. So that starts from maintaining your equipment. That starts in Finland. People in quite large amounts heating their houses with wood, and that requires work all through the cycle. So again, here if you think about seasonality in a year, you have ongoing winter work that takes place during the whole year, just to kind of prepare and be equipped and cope with winter. Coping with winter, what do people do in order to cope with winter? They winter tune their cars. They use, instead of car, they use the bus or taxi. They cancel activities. They draw on friends and relatives. They don't walk their dogs, but they just let the dog in a line outside. Proper housekeeping becomes particularly important. There are thoughts of kind of demand response already in 1999. So people are saying that they wash their clothes at night in order to save, electricity demand. And maybe this is also something interesting for seasonality, how the kind of winter, this is not from the diary data, all the other previous stuff was from the diaries that I mentioned in the beginning, but this is not from the diary. I just took it to better understand how we cope with winter. So this is about the road traffic. So winter speed limits are taking place in October. Spike tires are required in November. Accidents peak in January and then decline quite rapidly. So this is kind of like I don't know what is going on in the January peak of accidents, whether people learn to winter drive every winter again and again, or whether there is some kind of road condition explanations for that. I haven't looked into this, but I do think that we also learn winter every year again and again. Finally, this kind of like a more like a sensual or experiential aspect of a cold day. Certainly there's this kind of an enjoyment of hot and cold being kind of brought together in a way that you experience them both. So either having cups of tea or going to a lake to have a swim in the ice, or whatever you do, kind of also engage through this kind of experimental mode with at least with the winter season. Okay, these were my slides. I hope that it was useful for the seasonality discussion. I'm happy to discuss further.
Okay, thanks. I think probably the best thing is just to keep moving. So in preparing for this session, we thought it would be useful to read what's already been written about seasonality in the social sciences. And interestingly, there's not so much, but there is one really classic study. So I'm going to just go through some of the ideas from that classic study, partly because it's a really extreme case, partly because it follows nicely from contemporary Finnish experience. But I think it raises a lot of big questions about the social organisation and energy demand and how that combination changes. So Marcel Mauss, anthropologist, basically interested in the kind of structuring of society, not energy at all. But because he was studying these Eskimos, he was interested particularly in the relationship between the land, the resources that it offers, the nature, what kind of things, what kind of animals were being hunted and eaten. So walruses in the winter, caribou in the summer, and how that together constitutes the social environment of the Eskimo world. So there's lots of detail in the book, and I'm only going to pick out a few things. He was interested, and I think this is methodologically, in what's similar about Eskimo groups and what's different. What does an Eskimo kind of population need, and how is that organised? And some of those features of what's needed changed dramatically over the year. So in the winter, it's really important that there's a kind of cover of ice, that there's then open water for hunting seal, and then space in the landscape changes in the summer, more areas open up. So the practicalities of living and eating are very closely tied to these sort of natural patterns about seals and ice and wind and things like that. So it's very interesting, there's no kind of autumn or intermediate seasons. There's just winter and summer in this analysis. And that's tied exactly to the lives of these animals. So winter begins when walruses do something, and summer begins when reindeer and caribou do something. That's how, there's no messing around about the date or anything, it's just when these things happen. This is really important for the total organisation of this society. So as he's saying, in the summer, the population, the settlement changes. Basically, it's just a family group, man, wife, wives, whatever, one or two children. And they go off in these tents and they do their hunting and living in this kind of social unit. That is completely different from winter. In winter, multiple families come together and live in these kind of bunker type things, not actually igloos, but covered in grass and with long entranceways and so on. So, as Mouse says, there's a relationship between the structure of the house and the structure of the group that it accommodates, and therefore also the time of year. So, in the winter, the house, the wooden and brick and stone, not brick, wooden and stone structure accommodates multiple families. And because it does that, the rules, literally the laws of domestic life are different. What counts as property is different. There's different kind of forms of morality as well, winter and summer. You can see he's really into the kind of social organisation of society. But this is not made up. I mean, I think this is fantastic stuff. Can we imagine in contemporary Britain a kind of set of laws and moral codes that flip depending on the seasons? Yes, they have the winter tire and winter speed limits in Finland, but what about different forms of religious life flipping from one environment to another? So Mouse is really interesting and a good writer. And so he's not just describing summer versus winter, he's interested in the relation between these different configurations and this kind of alteration and movement through these seasonal rhythms. And he's quite keen to recognise that there are other rhythms within that, rhythms within the season, within the day and the week, and so on. Okay. I would strongly recommend it. It's very strangely written, but it's really great. For us, so why was I reading it? I was interested really to wonder, when did this, I mean, there's a kind of deseasonalisation thesis, if you like. When did this massively different structure of society on a seasonal basis disappear? So I have no idea when amongst these communities laws became year-round rules. I would like to know what aspects of this kind of extreme variation remain. And I think that's interesting in contemporary society. So Jacopo will say more, and perhaps Dale and Jen too, about the kind of hidden seasons that percolate through contemporary society. We don't recognise them as such. But it's also clear that there are certain, that all of these are held in place by sort of social arrangements. So there's some questions about how non-seasonality is configured, just as in the same kind of way as Mouse was talking about how seasonality was configured. So that's my go, and I would say, yeah, Eskimos are great. We've got Jen and Dale next.
We have not communicated over who's speaking when. So Dale, do you want to kick off and then point to me when you get stuck?
I can do, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Can you? Well, I'll provide a bit of context in that we've had a series of sort of conversations which ended up going a bit like this. So we kind of started to think, well, what exactly are seasons and how might we see them or conceptualize them as a first step in trying to think about how you might analyze, and these have all come up. So there's one sense, which is it related to weather, rain and heat? There's another sense is it related to light and dark or day and night? A third sense, which was kind of indoor, outdoor, and then a fourth sense, which is different types of social rhythms. So whether that's related to calendars, festivals, school holidays, for example, but also what scale might you think about those rhythms in terms of? So you can think of it across a 12-month year, but you can also think about what difference these kinds of rhythms might make in the context of a day or a week or whatever your unit of time might be. So we started to then think about, okay, well, what difference does it make to the things that people do if you have lots of sunlight in a day, and how might those kinds of activities change? So if you think of time, so I wasn't particularly interested in activities and time. If you think about this in the context of time, you can think about the duration of activities, the tempo, how those activities are synchronized with who or with what other activities, the timings, so when they actually happen, the frequency or periodicity of those activities and their sequence. So we started to wonder, what difference, for example, would it make if in the winter, where there's shorter hours of daylight, do we see activities have it disappearing, becoming less frequent, happening at different times, being connected or synchronized with other different types of activities, or do they stay the same? Do we see some activities speed up to fit into what is essentially a condensed period of time, or does none of this matter? Do we see the same patterning of activities in time, no matter what part of the year that is? Or does it matter? And if so, what kinds of seasonality may or may not matter? So is it a matter of weather? Is it a matter of light and dark? Is it a matter of whether activities are indoor or outdoor? Or does it matter more that it's, you know, I know that we eat more meat in December, and the 2 months of the year in which we eat the most meat is December and July, or at least the 2 months of the year in which supermarkets sell the most meat is December and July. I don't think that's to do with whether the hours of daylight, or necessarily that we eat indoors or outdoors, because I think July is barbecues, outdoor eating, and December is Christmas. So how can we start to explain any variations that we see, or if we don't see any variations in the patterning of activities? That's quite a strong argument for deseasonality, and then that leads to Elizabeth's question about how is non-seasonality configured. And then a kind of final set of questions that we came up with were whether or not seasonality matters for the ways in which these kinds of activities that we might see as being patterned are held together or assembled together into what we might think of as social practices. So those are the kinds of conversations that we'd had, that we thought, rather than hypothesize and scratch our heads, why not have a little play around with some of the time use data, which Jen has done, and Jen's going to talk about that now. And we wanted to just look at, can we see any variation, first and foremost, from a quick look at the time diary data, and secondly, what difference does it make? What difference does the sort of dawn and dusk make to the types of activities that are going on? Because dawn and dusk changes across the year. So we had an idea, which is to look at the sequencing and timing and what type of activities take place around the hour of dusk and dawn, or dawn and dusk, whichever way around. So Jen?
So I had a little play around with the most recent UK time use surveys. That was 2014, 2015. And first of all, as like a broad brush, what have we got? Kind of scoping exercise. I basically looked at every single practice that there was, broken down by the month to see if there's annual variation by month. But then I also kind of collapsed those 12 months down into 4 seasons to, again, just see if we could see variation by the British seasons. So as I say, we looked at all activities and aggregate duration, how much time was allocated to these activities across the day. And I looked at it at the most kind of chunky categories, where there's only nine categories classify all activities. And then I looked at it right down to the most detailed classification. So if you had a real interest in picking berries, mushrooms and herbs, I can tell you about that level of detail. So yeah, so basically, if you're not satisfied with the broader categories of physical activity, you could look in more detail at how much time was allocated to indoor sports, indoor team sports, outdoor team sports. You can really break it down to quite a lot of granularity. Main findings from this exercise were that none of the variation really could be described as tidal. Any variation that you did see by month and by season was much more subtle. But that's not to say that there wasn't any annual variation. I think I would push against the idea of deseasonality being an end state. I don't think we've reached that. There is certainly variance across the year, but I think it's much more nuanced and takes a little bit more unpicking to see exactly what's going on. For example, looking at seasons of sport, you see an increase and a proportional decrease in indoor and outdoor participation in sports. But this is also reflected in viewing of sport on television. So in the summer, there was an increase in viewing of sport. Around the time there was an increase in outdoor sports participation. So looking across practices to try and tease out some of these more nuanced details. Another really interesting one was annual variation in social life and entertainment. And I disaggregated this by men and women. I just wanted to look at how kind of seasonality and annual variation was potentially socially differentiated as well. So for men, the peak participation rate in social life and entertainment was in December. Surprise, surprise, Christmas. But for women, it actually peaked in August, and then also another peak in December. What was interesting about August was that actually then there was a decline in the proportion of women participating in paid work. It was also the point at which most annual leave was taken. So then you start to go, okay, well, this kind of annual variation that we observe, we've got to take seriously this idea of social seasonality, school holidays and annual leave and things like that, which are not totally divorced from natural seasonality. Obviously, school summer holidays are timed with the hottest part of the year, as are people's blocks of annual leave. So again, this goes back to the idea that maybe we should link time use data with weather observational data. It wouldn't be the first time that it's done, but I definitely think there's value in potentially pursuing that. And then I also looked, so that was just the broad brush analysis. I then took the practice of sleep to see how the practice of sleep is performed differently across the year. And again, in a nutshell, not a huge amount of annual variation actually. So this idea of daylight and the timing of sunrise and sunset, in the UK at least, doesn't seem to wildly affect people's pattern of sleep. What was potentially more interesting is that in August, people's rhythms of sleep were a little bit out of whack. And again, that ties in with the fact that people are on annual leave and they're waking up later and going to bed later than they do in other months of the year. And they sleep a lot more in August compared to other months of the year. So yeah, that was my little foray into the time use data, just to have a quick scope of what we might find. But I think in terms of taking it forward, it might be more interesting to look in more detail at maybe more discretionary practices, more practices that are more obviously affected by season. So gardening is an obvious one, but then also this kind of indoor outdoor sports participation. Yeah, so that's where I ended up from my play around with the data.
Our next move, I see Jacopo is here now, is to pick up perfectly seamlessly the energy implications of some of the patterns that you've just described from more of a focus on.
Thank you so much, and sorry for joining the party a bit late, but yeah, I think the idea is I'm going to, in this slide that you should see, what we can see is the red line represents electricity, national electricity demand, and the blue line represents gas, national gas demand over 3 years and a half, between 2017 and 2020 in Great Britain, and basically, and then we have the thin grey line, which stays for all liquid transport fuels. And basically, I was hunting for traces of seasonality, and basically Grant Wilson at the University of Birmingham produced this graph, which is great in many regards. It's basically from a systems level where we see seasonality, and we can see the blue line going up and down quite a lot depending on the season, and the red line, so electricity demand, staying fairly stable in terms of seasons. And then so the same might be said about the fuels we use for transport. And then you see a drop after March 2020, lockdown measures in place. So I asked myself, okay, but let's look at a lot of the stuff we do on demand-side flexibility looks at intraday or intraday variation or week level variation. And so it's not necessarily the case that how much the minimum and the maximum of demand in a day varies is the same, or that gas varies necessarily more. So that also depends on the season. And so, for instance, on the right hand here, you have during a really basically the East on the Beast, which was the coldest spot we experienced in recent years, where gas demand was at its maximum. We basically have that the variation between the minimum and the maximum was at its highest for gas. And whereas on the left side, we have a week in June 2017. And what we see is that the difference between a minimum and a maximum in demand for electricity is that distance, in a sense, between the minimum and the maximum is higher than for gas. So that I thought that's a nice way of understanding all the different, some of the different dynamics between seasons in terms of energy demand, and then basically. We have some data looking at low voltage feeders. This is in the south of England for as part of the Thames Valley Vision project. So feeders might be 80 or 120 households, but there might be smaller shops or schools. And indeed, I think the bottom right you see there, so the clock follows the different months of the year, and we have data for 2014 and 2015. And basically, you can see that there are some rhythms which are recurrent in some of the feeders. So, for instance, the bottom right one might have a school that has a strong reductions in electricity demand during half terms and end of terms periods, for instance. And other than that, this nice animation really shows you that at still a fairly aggregate level, because as I said, this might be 100 homes or something like that. There are you can start noticing some patterns, and noticeably there is a bit of higher demand in winter periods, even if it's electricity. Now, that's probably because it's getting closer to having less industrial electricity demand, less of a large commercial electricity demand, which maybe tends to be deseasoned, coming back to what I understood Elizabeth said while I wasn't there. And basically, so I say, okay, let's zoom in even more. And then there's obviously now a wealth of information coming out of smart meter data. These are London homes, and the data was captured as part of a low carbon London project. But basically, seasonality might mean different things for different homes inevitably, and there's more spikiness. For instance, the one in the middle and up, the second one from left to right at the top seems to have higher peaks in different months, and somewhere seasonality matters less, like the one below that seems to less seasonally. Of course, these are just observations on individual electricity demand levels at a smart meter level. So obviously, seasonality will have effects, different effects also in different decades and different times of year. So some work we did with Ben Anderson at the University of Southampton as part of Demand tried to look at, for instance, differences in time use data across 4 different decades. And so one starting observation, just looking at the national grid electricity demand data, is that for the month of July, you have a different national electricity pattern of demand than it was in 2016 than it was in the case in 2006. So that black line, which represents 2016, has shifted to the right in the evening. So the evening peaks happen a bit later or are shifted to later, particularly in the month of July. And this is so having looked at the time use data for those for across different decades, we notice that people in general eat later in the evening. There's more media use later into the evening, and so as well as many other observations around, in a sense, for instance, middle of the day, lunchtime not happening. So one could ask the question: so how much of these is driven or is connected to seasons or not? And indeed, more research would be needed in this area. So a bit like Jen, what she presented, I picked some with my colleagues. We picked some practices, thinking, well, that could be seasonal. So care. So we have these clocks. This time represent 24-hour clock, and we have on the left a weekday, in the middle Saturdays, and on the right Sundays. And we basically you can see the different months passing by, and the different shapes in terms of occurrence or engagement with care practices. How these vary, and intuitively there is something about what Jen said about organizational rhythms and when schools are open, and so for instance we see September seems to have quite a high level of care. And so does January, but obviously things that people do on Saturday seem to change depending on the month of the year. So we also looked at so Jose looked at household upkeeping to show you these nice animations around how these vary between months and whether the time of the day changes. So this is about doing repairs, DIY, cleaning, and it seems to increase during warm months. Things like spring cleaning and so on are real than during cold months. And then my colleague Mate produced basically, we thought, okay, gardening is something which is inevitably seasonal, right? And so we have these are heat maps. So basically, the blue represents there's not much going on, and because the horizontal axes are time of the day, of course, there's not much gardening at night, as one would expect. And then you'd really observe what you would expect. So the red areas are where there's a more concentrated activities around gardening, and you see what we would expect. So spring and summer having not only higher levels of gardening but also more spread across the day. And then Jen mentioned sporting activity. activities. Now, we didn't separate between outdoors and indoors, and so actually found quite a spread across, with quite a lot of January, February, March, so kind of what are winter season, maybe a lot of New Year's propositions there, and in a sense a less spread sporting activities in the autumn. But yeah, one way that in the past I thought of seasonality is thinking, okay, what if we could capture how time-dependent practices are across not only the day, as in how much they repeat themselves, how much people perform the same practices around the same time of the day, but how that varies during season. So it's just, to conclude, it's just, in a sense, a suggestion for research, and in CREDS, in the flexibility team, we're doing work. Stan and Jose are developing work on a repetition index, which is, in a sense, a consequence of that, in a sense, how repeated, how routinized certain practices are, and clearly what's the role of seasonality in there. And yeah, so I'll probably just conclude with this. So these are 6 different practices, and you can see probably consistently. This is 2005 data, but consistently with what Jen said, there's nothing tidal about it. Washing clothes seem to be quite connected with, in terms of time dependence, with seasons. So we, for instance, there's a lower time dependence in June for most practices, apart from washing clothes. So I won't go into too much of the details on the time dependence work, but it's one way. Of course, there could be many of thinking of how do we consistently think about seasonality. I would like to thank, obviously, the nice graphs. There's not a single one which is from me, but my colleagues, Jose, Timur, and Mate, helped me put together the data and all the nice animations. I would like to thank them.
That's great, thanks, Jacopo. So we've had quite a kind of rapid tour of spinning the topic of seasonality around, looking at it this way and that, with different kinds of data and different sorts of ideas. The purpose wasn't to come to an answer about what seasonality is, and actually these presentations have shown how many different ways there are of thinking about it. But what would be really good, and these are always difficult situations to manage, I think what we'll do is just go around everybody who hasn't spoken to do a kind of map of what was spiked their interest, or just one thought or observation that might connect with their own work or maybe doesn't, but that sort of elaborates on the unfolding agenda. And exactly what we do with this remains an open question, but that's the nature of these exploratory ventures into the unknown. I've got a little list which might not include everybody, but I'm just going to go for it anyway. Starting with Nick Hare, who's first on my screen. Nick, what caught your attention there?
Lots of things caught my attention, but as always, when something catches your attention, your thoughts sort of drift into particular areas. So, really, 2 fairly random thoughts to add into the overall mix. I guess the first is because I'm interested in impacts on the energy system, and often those are driven by extremes. And we saw some examples of Beast for the East, a very cold day in Finland. And they're not quite the same as seasonality, are they? They are, but they're clearly a function of seasonality and time of day as well. So, I mean, I think that's just something to think about. We may not be interested in pure seasonality, as in the average between seasons. They may also be interested in the combined effect of seasonality, diurnality, if that's a word, and whatever it is that drives extremes, but often that's weather, which clearly is seasonally dependent.
Yeah.
The second thing I was left wondering is if we're thinking about energy systems that are in a way reversing the trends that we've seen in modernity from towards more reliance on immediately available natural resources, and I think that's a broad generalization, but it's an interesting one. And clearly the demand on supply systems is a function of both practices and the extent to which resources are stored, which I think you'd probably tell me is another form of practice, but and that's right, but it's a particularly important one in terms of the coupling of supply and demand. Should we be looking at other systems, notably, I guess, food, maybe water as well, because they are more reliant, even through modernity, they've been more reliant on immediately available natural resources than energy has, well, because energy's been using stuff that's been underground for some hundreds of millions of years. So those are two. I mean, they're not very profound thoughts, but they're what I was thinking.
Their thoughts all the same. Yeah. Michelle.
Hi, sorry. So I was thinking, thank you, that was really fascinating. And I was thinking about more about clock time, I suppose, and how we're using clock time in the graphs and in the calculations and how it's being represented in animations. I guess that was what really sort of piqued my interest. And I was thinking about how in the animations, when we were seeing the days in Jacopo's presentation, we were seeing the movements around the days, but we didn't see the sort of movement of the daylight hours. I suppose that everything was getting translated into 24-hour time. And I guess I was thinking about how older ways of telling time, for example, where you didn't have standard hours, where the hour was longer or shorter, depending on the season. And so things like saying that something happens at the same time in December as it does in June is only the case if you're using a 24-hour clock. But if you're thinking about seasonal time, you could say, well, this happened 5 hours after sunrise and this happened 3 hours after sunrise. So they're not the same time necessarily if you're looking at it from that perspective. So I'm not sure how much difference that would actually make to the work you've been doing, but I'm just wondering that it's not there, that or it didn't, I couldn't see it there. I'm sure probably you have thought about it. I was asking Jen in the chat about it too, and how could we make that more obvious, maybe that in those animations, I suppose, that it's not, there's a danger of translating everything back into 24-hour time because it wipes out the very differences that we're sort of looking for, I suppose, if you're thinking about daylight hours. So if it was in a proportion of daylight hours, does it stay the same? Would that graph be or that animation look the same as the one put into 24 hours?
That's great. I mean, we can imagine Jen and Jacopo, or Jacopo's kind of autumn leaf pictures, you know, changing colour literally as the length of the day changes.
Yeah, and like there's clock, you know, like people, you know, sort of artists and designers are doing clocks where you could have, you know, the hand takes the daylight hours to go around once, and then the nighttime hours, so the speed of the time changes. But it's just the way we represent these things. And I was thinking about a study about butterflies that there was in the news just yesterday about how they study it on the 17th of August, whatever it is, the same day every year. And they say it's the same day every year, but for the butterfly, it's not the same day because it was warmer this year because their calendar is driven by temperature. It was warmer in the spring. Their time worked faster this year. So when you're translating it back into our calendar time, it doesn't capture the time that the butterfly is following, for example. So just to draw out that distinction, I suppose.
I've got Stan next on my list.
Hi. Yeah, loads of stuff that I thought was really interesting. I mean, just to kind of name a couple of them, I suppose history I thought was really interesting. And the Elizabeth, your example, taking the mouse stuff from the Eskimos, thinking about, I mean, that change, or, you know, this, not just the change there, but then where does it go and why? And also how obvious would that change have been to the Eskimos? And both the between seasons, they're 2 seasons, apparently. I guess it must be really obvious, because you move from outside and above ground and to a different family system to another. But then on the other hand, I'm wondering in another way that those seasons might be, you know, were they really stark or not like that? Is that just where you go? And I suppose that got me thinking about Jen's point as well, when she said deseasonalization, and thinking about deseasonalization, and that actually maybe it's not looking at the time use data, that we're not kind of at an end point there. I think Jen said there's going to be international variation as well and all the rest of it, but this idea that you can still see the seasons, even if they're not tidal, it's more subtle than that. And then it got me thinking that actually in some of the other graphs, I think Jacopo presented on some of the practices, that actually it's different for different practices, for cleaning, for sports, for whatever. They have this kind of like annual variation. So it is subtle, but then of course en masse, you know, those practices are connected and interrelated. So en masse, it kind of is tidal, but hidden by the ways we're trying to get to it. And just as a sort of like connector to that, I thought that Miko's point about that some of the things that happen, some of the activity that happens in seasons and that we think of as being for that season are actually extended through the year. So, you know, the winter work that extends through the year, the preparation for the winter, I thought that was really interesting too. And then last, I also thought that animations are really powerful. That Jacopo showed at the end. I think they're a powerful way of showing, you know, lots of things, like even the total amount of time that's being given to different activities, how that's changing on different days. And I think that's really interesting. So I guess for me, what I thought though is that some of those things might, what's interesting is to think about connecting some of those. So, you know, how the variation is happening during the week on the weekdays as the seasons change, but thinking about that in connection, and then with the history as well. So there's so much coming up really.
I've already said it's Debbie next, and after Debbie it's going to be Mike.
Hi everyone, thank you. I really enjoyed this. It actually took me back to my PhD was on something that was quite different to what I do now, and it was around snow and climate. And so much of this got me thinking about then how I was talking to people about climate change and changes in the ski season and snow, and when snow was there and when it wasn't there, and what it meant for how people interpreted where they were. And so much of that, actually, if you're thinking about climate and climate change, like how seasons are shifting, and there is so much of a conversation about whether or not we still have 4 seasons, the way that we've understood them, when the seasons start, when they stop. And so for certain sectors, that's really important, because it's when they do particular things and how they organise and schedule when those activities are going to take place, when they're going to open, when they're going to close, and such like. So it's been really nice kind of thinking about seasons again, and how the assumptions about, you know, time, I thought that about the guys was really lovely, and how we might be completely misunderstanding all sorts of things based on these assumptions about time and the structure of seasons. But I had like 2 things that I really thought about around the seasons and weather and light, and I think so in terms of weather, it was interesting that it was kind of the extremes that we pointed to, and we were thinking about, like, the examples were kind of an extremely cold day and, you know, extremely snowy environments and whatever it might be, and how or you know, there's a reason why why extremes become easier to think about and talk about. But I wondered then, given the climate in the UK, I mean, we don't have an awful lot of extremes here, right? We actually have quite kind of blah, like mundane weather that kind of seeps into all seasons. And I wondered what that meant for how we then think about seasons, because we still talk as though we have 4 seasons, when actually it's as likely it'll be 20 degrees in, well, it's not statistically as likely, but, you know, we could have a 20-degree day in October and we could have a 20-degree day in July, and, you know, but they feel very different, and what we would do in them would be very different. And that's, then I was thinking about how we enact seasonality through the practices. So through as we just heard from Stanley about like the planning for the seasons. And so I was thinking about like shifting, particularly when I was younger. It probably maybe happens slightly less now, you know, that my mom would like get out different clothes in preparation for the seasons. We would get out our coats, and then if we had like an extremely warm day, we would just have to wear our coat because it was out now. Or, you know, like how we kind of locked in doing particular things, that we have barbecues in the summer even when the weather is really bad, and we just hold an umbrella and we still do it. And maybe that's a function of our weather system in the UK, because I know in some of the countries that would be considered bizarre behaviour. Going to the seaside in the summer, because you go to the seaside in the summer regardless of, and so is that about a seasonal practice that is so locked in that we would do it anyway? Or is it something else about kind of Britishness, or about the lack of predictability of our climate? I'm not quite sure. But then thinking about light, so there has been literature in mobilities and transport studies to a particular degree around light, around illumination. And in New Zealand, there was a lot around this, or I say a lot, there was some work around this, around kind of street lighting, and how that linked to the energy system more broadly. And I think that there's some interesting things there about what we do and don't do, what associations we have with different degrees of luminosity. So like safety, perceived safety, risk, danger, all of these things, places we will and won't go. So from a travel, transport, movement point of view, you know, places that we will go to and won't go to, even in our local areas, based on whether it is lit or not. And then what that means potentially for us, you know, say accessing a bus stop. If we can't access a bus stop that's close to our home because it requires walking down a dark alley, which, you know, early morning in summer would be doable, but early morning in winter might not. And then a final point was thinking about loitering, you know, this. Are we more purposeful, I guess, in particular seasons? Do we stop and linger and smell the roses in the summer, but in winter we kind of move with more directionality and more attention? And then, yeah, from a transport mobility point of view, like what does that then mean for how we get around in ways that might not be accounted for if we just talk about modes and we just talk in kind of more blanket ways?
And also maybe destinations. Mike, and then Samuele.
Hi, yeah, so thanks for those presentations. It's really fantastic to be having this discussion surrounding the seasons, and it's very relevant for me because this is what my PhD is all about, so it's great to have this. And I'm interested, at the moment, I'm looking at how sort of social and temporal rhythms figure within seasonal energy demand in my research. And my current research is looking at how the seasons can be thought of as possibly elusive and sort of hidden from what sort of maybe some sets of data might display. And I sort of had one prevailing thought from this discussion. We are seeing the overlap between social and natural seasons with, you know, with Jacopo's energy graphs and the time use data that Jen and Dale showed, and Miko and the role of winter and, you know, practices that are embedded seasonally. But these are still sort of aligning with the peaky seasons of what summer and winter can be classed as. So I'm wondering about that alignment. I'm wondering about the sort of hidden seasons that might straddle those peaks and troughs of both energy demand and practices. And that also applies to sort of Elizabeth's Eskimos, because, you know, they've got such a sharp distinction of when winter and summer starts. And yeah, Jacopo's graphs had the, you know, the curve of seasonality from low demand in summer to high demand in winter. I guess I was wondering more, is there permeation into both spring and autumn? You know, we have these social and cultural seasons. We have, you know, Easter, we have sporting season starting after August, we have October half term in the schools, we have Black Friday, which is now a sort of, cultural event, and that's, taking people out of the house. I don't know, is there anything more going on beyond the distinctions between summer and winter? And I guess I was wondering whether how seasonality is enacted in the way of creating that distinction, and how seasonality is defined in that sort of way. Yeah. So that was sort of my thinking, was what's hidden.
Samuele, to be followed by Yohei.
There we are. Hello. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you for these excellent presentations. Yeah. Well, yeah, there were several points to take. I mean, that just will flow in a random order. I mean, like the contrast between the cold winter and hot summer. I mean, when Nico was showing his presentation, or where you were showing as well, Elizabeth, I mean, I've been thinking immediately, okay, of the underground city, Montreal, Canada, or like, okay, an hotel in Alaska where people, I mean, a village in Alaska actually, where people have shops inside a building that spend several months without going outside at the time. I mean, that's like, and well, we were a kind of facing this dichotomy, lights, dark, cold, hot. I mean, I think, yeah, another important element is we consider places that are closer to the equator that do not experience so much variation in daylight, but in rainfall. I mean, that have a dry and a wet season that changes things completely. I recall, I mean, once I traveled to Burkina Faso, there were the two plains. I was there in winter, something I said, okay, but that's totally dry. Why do they have this type of architecture and everything? And they told me, okay, the winter, on the other hand, I mean, it's the wet season. Or I remember going to the border close with Mali. There was the Beli River, a huge river. I mean, the riverbed was 100 meters wide, but it was totally dry, and I was jogging in the river because, I mean, that there was not a single drop of water right there. So, I mean, a point is that seasonality and the coupling with nature. I mean, I think something we will want to explore is whether moving from, if you wish, a rural context to an urban context, this coupling with nature is removed. I don't want to say whether removed or weakened at least, okay, because we have seen that still there are some seasonal patterns also in urban context. And well, a final reflection is that this is especially inspired by the presentation from Nico. I mean, in terms of infrastructure, we need in extreme circumstances. I mean, I remember that in Kretz, I mean, especially Jose Jacopo, that there is the talk around core capacity. It's fine, but I mean, there's going to be for sure some need for some redundant infrastructure to face these extreme periods of the years of extreme events. So I mean, how this is going to affect, I mean, accounting, because I mean, probably these I mean, are rebels itself in terms of power capacity rather than accounting in terms of energy, because it takes place at different temporal scale. I mean, but not even in terms of accounting. I mean, I think an Elizabeth presentation is that how it shapes practices differently when different material artifacts, I mean, when different elements come into play. I mean, that was extremely relevant for the case of the DS schema, but to an extent it also applied to other contexts. So I mean, just to throw in some reflections that, I mean, could be interesting to explore flexibility. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, and you're right, we do need to be speeding up a little bit, but it's Yohei, followed by Greg.
Hi, everyone. I enjoy your talks. So I had an interest in the seasonality in time use, because Japanese time use data doesn't have any season-related information. So I haven't seen any seasonality in the Japanese time use survey data, but I noticed that it's very the seasonality has a big influence in time use. So as an engineer, I develop simulation model of energy demand of buildings, and I usually assume that people's activity doesn't change in different seasons. So now I noticed that we have to consider, but it's I want to distinguish the influence of the season originated from the change in activity and originated from other factors. So I want to interested in to distinguish activity-driven change and non-activity related change. And one more thing is that the impact of the climate change. Debbie also has already pointed out, but in Japan, we have a very hot summer, and the temperature in summer season go up and up every year. So now people in Japan is trying to avoid to spend time outside during the summer daytime. So this has a very big influence. The parents avoid to their children go out, and people spend more time inside indoor environment. So the seasonality has a big influence, and the climate change changes this people's activity and energy demand. Thank you very much. That's all.
Right. Yeah. Indoors and outdoors. I think we're going to have another entire session on this topic. But Greg, next.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks everyone for your presentations. I've always been genuinely interested why there's been a lack of seasonality in transport policy, which is the area I tend to work in. But things that struck my interest, or maybe areas for further exploration, relate to institutional seasonality and where the traces of those are. So there's a lot of, for example, winter weather planning in the NHS. There's definitely a seasonality of patterns of treatments and stays in hospitals and things. In the transport sector, one of the few seasonal things that we have is we have a December winter timetable for trains, which changes in May to a summer timetable. So we only have 2 seasons. But whether that's actually really particularly seasonal now, or whether that's just down to the difficulty of changing timetables, could be interesting to explore. I'm sure it's got a history to it. Dog walking on beaches was about the only other kind of activity-based restriction that I could think of that changed a lot. But that does come back to the reflection on, holidays. That's all about when beaches are busy or not, terms and so on. So I thought that was an interesting part of the discussion, the kind of rhythms of holidays. I wondered about financialization and whether that's having an influence on homogenizing some aspects of practice. So big money building event venues, accommodation, aircraft, all these sorts of things. Once they're there, they need to be filled, and so perhaps some of there's a pressure to kind of fill across the years that we didn't used to see. The discussion on weather, I think, was something we have seen in transport. Debbie picked up on some of that, but it is quite distinct to seasons, and the work that's been done has been quite difficult in terms of actually working out what people's real exposure was on the routes that they travelled, and also whether they understood that they were going to get rained on, for example, at the point where they went out in the first place. And that made me think about whether perhaps there are parts of society or users that are more impacted by seasonality than others, and how much that might be conditioned or normalised by country and conditions. We know there's loads of places that are colder, wetter, windier and darker on average in the UK where people cycle more, but that might be because of their expectations and preparedness and equipment. So the whole practice of, for example, cycling is quite different, but perhaps the expectations that it's going to be quite different are much clearer. So those are the things that kind of stuck out for me.
Stefan, and then James.
Hello. Thanks. Just to reiterate, really interesting talks. I think I'd share quite a few of the points which have been raised, so I'll try not to repeat too much. But one of the things that struck me sort of was with the contrast with your presentation, Elizabeth, and Miko, yours, in that you have 2 sort of different setups, one which is working with seasonality and one which is trying to work regardless of that seasonality. And it was with the regardless of seasonality where you have the whole requirement of more infrastructure, and actually the whole idea of planning for extremes, and the infrastructure is there to deal with those extremes, to allow the sort of, almost the clock time to rule in terms of what we do, rather than the sort of natural rhythms that we see. And it was interesting seeing a Finnish case of winter compared to my sort of experience is not just of the UK but of Iceland and what happens in winter there, with the idea of shutting pools or swimming, right? That, you know, something you just wouldn't do in Iceland. There's geothermally heated outdoor pools and they're open all year, you know, and that's the expectation. And it's news if they have to shut, you know. So there was just sort of, you know, to me that was just a highlight of sort of, you know, the differences that we might expect in different cultures and so on, and what might be brought about, or why those different expectations are brought about. And I think that sort of relates really to what Greg was saying at the end on expectations, and sort of picking up on Debbie's point of barbecues in the summer. Again, in Iceland, you barbecue in the winter and the summer, regardless of the weather, because it's just, you know, the weather's not going to be good. You know that, so you're not planning for the weather. You're just doing what you sort of want, regardless. But so all of that to me was, leading to that idea of we try to work regardless of seasonality. And we have some sort of level of disconnection there. And I think there's, you know, lots of reasons around the infrastructure we have in place which allow us to do that, but also sort of the sort of global connections we have in terms of food supply and so on.
Hello, nice to meet you all. My background and my work is mainly in energy and how to secure the communications networks of energy systems. And I think the thing that sort of stuck out to me was Elizabeth's talk about how the Eskimos sort of change their rule structure depending upon the seasons. So one of the big points of contention in my work is the rules that sort of ensure the safety of the electrical infrastructure sort of really bite into the bandwidth of ensuring the security of the communications infrastructure that governs it. So that kind of adaptability in rules, and whether it be sort of like kind of the day in Finland where you have periods where you prepare for a new season of energy demands, might be then used to kind of give leeway in sort of the security and the safety rules to kind of balance it out in different seasons. So that was my very kind of brief thoughts about all the talks. But thank you very much for the talks.
Nicola, then.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. They were all very inspired, but just a short point. I thought about seasonality also in terms of suspension, the capability of suspending socially the activities during specific seasons. And I just wondering whether this social capability of temporarily suspending activity could be kept also within a transition to renewables, when, for example, sudden interruption of the electricity supply might occur, no? And how this social capability could be stimulated and be important for a transition to renewables. And that's it. That's all.
Okay, but I get the sense, I thought this might happen. I think seasonality is really kind of vibrant field, connecting all sorts of different issues, and that with a bit more thought and maybe some more contributions, we could really build a kind of seasonality agenda that connects all sorts of different disciplines, from energy modelling, time use data, social theory, in a way that I'd never imagined or thought about before. And of course, connecting to the kind of long-term renewable energy, short-term energy demands, and so at various different temporal scales as well. Not just the disappearance of the seasons, as we've seen. It's much more subtle, much more complicated than that. So we are going to finish this session any minute now, but I think I'll just say I think we should have another meeting on this topic. We've got one on contingency plan for some time. We've been deliberately vague about this, sometime in December. Depends. That's the nature of the topic. But maybe we should come back to seasonality with contributions, a bit like we've had. I think the little talks were fine to spark off stuff from some of the people who've been here, but who could pick up some. We could just hear again from another 3 or 4 people on this broad issue of seasonality. I've yet to talk with the boss about that, but we can pick that up later on. I'll leave that there and say that yes, we are working towards the next one on contingency. We don't know what it's going to be about. We don't know when it's going to be, but it'll be in December. And Debbie and Stan and I don't know who else will be part of that. Is there anything more to say, Jacopo, for example?
No, Elizabeth, I think a brilliant reading room, and you're right about the topic being, I came in thinking, oh, it must vary. I'm not saying about peaks in Italy, now the summer is a new peak season, and, I try to stay away from that. And I'm thinking mostly of variations of seasonality in terms of time and space, but the dimensions are so many that it really deserves further attention.
See you all again soon. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.